Donkey Kong is one of Nintendo's oldest original characters. And though he's had a ton of different games throughout the years, the most popular series by far is Donkey Kong Country. Some people say these are the best platformers of all time, so recently I replayed them all to find out if they're really that good. The first Donkey Kong Country was a pretty interesting move for Nintendo. Donkey Kong was once one of their premier games, but by the time the Super Nintendo came around, Nintendo had moved on to other franchises. So since they were busy making games like Super Mario World and A Link to the Past, they gave the reins over to a little studio called Rare. Now, Rare had been working with Nintendo's hardware for years at this point, making some really solid games like Battletoads, The Amazing Spider-Man, and who could forget John Elway's quarterback.
Rest in peace. He's alive. I'll be honest, I have no idea who that is.
So other than being named Rare, they were just a pretty average studio up until the release of the Super Nintendo. This is where they really stepped up their production, investing in things like Silicon Graphics workstations, which allowed them to 3D model characters and then convert those into sprites. And at this time, you would think that Rare was performing dark rituals to get these graphics, because they were like nothing that anyone was doing on the console. These were mesmerizing. Other Super Nintendo games like Super Mario World, Super Metroid, and F-Zero looked really good, but this was good enough to go on the fridge. These graphics gave Donkey Kong Country and its sequels a level of visual polish that looked so good it didn't even look like it belonged on the console. You gotta remember that at this time, Nintendo was competing hard with Sega. The console wars were in full swing, with both companies trading insults through magazines, commercials, and even fan indoctrination. And Sega had adopted a persona of being the console for people who were cooler and edgier.
I'm really cool. I'm wearing a sideways hat and drinking a diet soda. My parents are divorced.
But with the release of Disney's Aladdin on the Genesis, which had the help of real Disney animators for the designs, Sega seemed to have a ton of confidence in themselves. I bet that's gonna turn out well in the long run. So Nintendo needed something of their own to compete. So when they saw a tech demo of what Rare could do with their new SGI graphics, they decided to give them access to one of their existing IPs to make a full game out of. Now, up until this point, Donkey Kong had only really been known for throwing barrels at Mario and kidnapping brunettes, but that was all about to change. Development began in 1993 with a team of about 12 people, which was the largest team that Rare had ever assembled for any game up to that point. They designed all of the characters and backgrounds as 3D models, then animated them, rendered every frame, and compressed them into sprites for the Super Nintendo. And Nintendo was so confident in what Rare was making, they ended up buying a large part of the company. But after an excruciating 18 months of development, the game finally released. And this was the title that everybody had to have, quickly setting the record as the fastest selling game of all time at its initial release, turning Donkey Kong from an outdated character to one of their premier mascots seemingly overnight. They went a complete new direction with the story, introducing a ton of new characters and an entire new world to explore. The story was about as deep as any Mario game would be. King K. Rool and his Kremling army decide to raid Donkey Kong Island and steal his banana hoard. So Donkey Kong, alongside his partner Diddy, not that one, decide to travel across the island to get them back. Now, nobody was picking this up and thinking,
oh great heavens, how will these fine chums ever find their ladyfingers?
It's a 3D platformer where you play as monkeys. I think people were more interested in the gameplay, which was incredible. You can play as both Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong, who both have their own strengths and weaknesses. Donkey Kong is bigger and stronger, while Diddy Kong is smaller but faster. You can swap whenever you want, but if one gets knocked out, you have to find a barrel to get them back. And this alone was a great way for this to feel distinct from any other Nintendo 2D platformer. If you prefer to play as one of the two characters, you could just do that. Or if you want to swap situationally, you can do that too. There was never really a best case of who to use when, because whoever you were playing as was a misjump away from being banished to the Shadow Realm. There were 6 worlds and around 40 stages. And though this all takes place on DK Island, the level designs were pretty interesting. There was a solid variety whether you were in a jungle, a mine, or underwater. And though the themes themselves were nothing shocking, what made them stand out was how alive these worlds felt. Stages would have different weather effects like fog, lightning, or snowstorms that made each level feel like a living environment. And even more so, the way the whole world blended together made you feel like you were really exploring the whole island. It wasn't just a set of levels loosely connected by a similar theme, it felt like an actual location. The overall presentation is what made this so memorable, whether it was the incredibly tight level design or the soundtrack by David Wise that also earned him a spot on the fridge. The whole package was nearly perfect.
I'm gonna throw this piece of junk off a bridge.
I have played a ton of platformers. It's one of my favorite things outside of complaining. But something about this series makes me want to protest in the streets. This was hard. Now, it's not difficult to a point where it's unfair or poorly designed, but every time I die in this game, I get one step closer to strangling a primate. Now, I haven't played a ton of them, but this compares to a Souls-like, because the difficulty is high, but not in a punishing way. It's more so a challenge because the levels are designed so well. They're all built so if you run and time your jumps well, you can blast through it in a rhythmic flow. Chaining jumps and rolls together feels so natural and satisfying the entire time. It is like the video game equivalent of buying a scratch-off. I just want to do it more. Outside of the standard platforming levels, there were other types that gave this its signature charm. Arguably the most notable being the minecart levels, where you ride at high speeds, dodging enemies, and collecting even more bananas. These were all about timing and were arguably the most fun part of this game. There's just something about jumping from railway to railway that will always feel satisfying. And there were even segments where you gotta ride around on different animals. The buddies like Rambi the rhino, Angard the swordfish, and Espresso the ostrich all felt unique, even though this bird makes me wildly uncomfortable.
Why is it wearing shoes?
They're animals riding animals. I don't think the logic is really there, but it's fun to do. Each of the stages were full of collectibles, whether it was the bananas, extra life balloons, or the 4 letters KONG.
Nog.
And for the other illiterate people out there, there were even hidden bonus barrels to encourage you to explore every corner of the stage. The amount of secrets and things to collect really set the stage for not only the other games in the series, but for every other future Rare platformer that they would make down the line. As far as 2D platformers go, this was way ahead of its time. Everything about the world itself, to the great difficulty and the incredible atmosphere made this not only one of the most enjoyable games to play at the time, but even to this day. This came out in 1994, the same time where OJ was on trial for something he allegedly may or may not have done, but it still feels just as good now as it did then. And the only real complaint I have here is that playing as Donkey Kong wasn't the best experience. It was a DK game, so naturally I assumed he would be the star of the show. But every single time I play this, I really just want to play as Diddy, again not that one, because he is just better to control. But with the game doing absolute numbers and almost everybody's universal praise, Rare was set to do it again with Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Kong Quest. Before the first title even became the hit sensation it was, they had already began developing the sequel with the goal to make it more difficult and intricate than the last time around. While the first title had more of a focus on creating a new way to experience games on the Super Nintendo, this wanted to refine it and make it a better experience. They first showed off the game at E3 1995. Nintendo really wanted to push this as one of the leading holiday titles for their console, while the rest of the industry was focusing on the new technologies like 32 and 64-bit graphics. The PlayStation 1 had already released in Japan and was coming really soon to North America. So while this still looked really good, especially for the Super Nintendo, people were less impressed this time around. But Nintendo and Rare really doubled down, trying to make this a title that was built for quote-unquote real gamers. So not only was it more difficult and atmospheric, they also made a full Donkey Kong game where you can't play as Donkey Kong.
Why would they name a game off someone you're rescuing? That could never work.
Who needs to invite the big guy when you have an invite to a full Diddy party? He was already the character that a lot of people preferred to play in the original game, so why not give him his own adventure? And they were so confident that this game would sell that they even started building a port for the Virtual Boy, which ended up getting scrapped because it was for the Virtual Boy. Now, at its initial release, this was still successful, but not as big as the first time around. Not only were games expensive, they were also directly competing with another Nintendo 2D platformer, being Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, so it's hard to compete with Nintendo even if you are Nintendo. But this still ended up being the second best-selling game of that year. Now, just like the first game, the story here existed but was not groundbreaking by any means. King K. Rool got a demotion of sorts, becoming Captain K. Rool, who kidnaps DK and keeps him prisoner at Crocodile Isle. So it's up to Diddy and Dixie to go on an adventure to get him back. This time around, there is a completely different setting, changing the island theme for more of a pirate adventure. And this was exactly my cup of tea. This is unique. They did have some levels, of course, that were pretty generic, like lava and forests, but overall, the atmosphere and themes here were an incredible change. And the playable characters here were an overall improvement too. Diddy Kong is mostly the same, however, he does feel a bit better here. In the air, he's a bit tighter, and his rolls feel better. And Dixie Kong was immediately more fun to play as than Donkey Kong ever was. She is slower, but more than makes up for it by being able to whip her hair in a circle to hover in midair. This allowed you to close gaps and cover distances that you weren't able to do in the first game. And this allowed the developers to create even more intricate level designs, with more secrets and hidden areas to discover than ever before. Outside of the level themes being different, they also went a completely new direction with the level designs.
Up.
Verticality was the focus of the design, where you were going not only from left to right, but also from top to bottom. Whether you were climbing ropes or using gusts of wind or sticky walls, there was a new focus on the levels being more than just going from left to right. And this not only made a better sense of scale, but made the level designs themselves even more fun. Each stage is so deep, where you need to use a bunch of different options to progress, which can be very hard, but also so rewarding. Like the first game, animal buddies make a return, both introducing new buddies and making the returning ones feel more substantial. Some return like Rambi and On Guard, while others were forgotten like the stupid bird. And some of the new buddies were pretty great, like Rattly the snake, who jumps really high. And there were other new ones too, like Squitter the spider.
I have nothing to say about this.
Other than him being horrifying, the new animal buddies were pretty fun to use. They have unique gimmicks that make a game that is already technically deep even more so. And speaking of gimmicks, this time around there were even more gimmick stages that enhance the experience. Whether it's the roller coaster stages that make the minecarts even more fun, or the bramble levels with arguably the best music and backgrounds that I have seen in any video game that I have ever played. There was always some sort of variety in what you were doing that was just enough to keep you engaged while also innovating the formula even further. Collectibles are back, of course, with a lot of returning ones like bananas and Kong letters, alongside a couple of new options like Cranky's hidden coins, which are available in every single stage, alongside Creme coins for beating bonus areas. These are just as much fun to find as last time around, and it helps give the game that signature rare feeling where you can easily blow through the game and get a good experience, while still having a ton of depth for completionists who want something to strive for. Outside of Dixie Kong, there were some more Kongs along for the adventure. There was Wrinkly Kong, who was fittingly old and wrinkly, and Swanky Kong, who has my favorite name ever and hosts a game show where you can earn bonus lives. And adding more characters like this helps the world feel even more unique and alive than it did before. It enhances the feelings of the first game without detracting from that experience, making a world that feels even more substantial than just DK Island. This felt like a true sequel. While this was competing with Yoshi's Island, which was technically a sequel to Super Mario World, that felt more like a new game than anything else. Everything the first game did right, this did too, and took it even further. The graphics looked better and moodier, which helped give it its signature aesthetic. The level design was tough but rewarding, with a ton to uncover even if it was really hard. The levels were paced immaculately, with the beginning of a level introducing a concept and then building on it to its absolute extent towards the end of the stage. When you're chaining together movement options like rolls and glides, everything feels so nice. While the first game thrived off its simplicity and beauty, this was just a natural progression that really carried the torch for the series. And I can see why this is looked at as not only the best in the original trilogy, or even the series as a whole, but one of the best experiences that you could have on the Super Nintendo. But shockingly, they still weren't done here, and the team went on to create Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. When you have enough confidence to bring a game to the Virtual Boy, you can expect that it's gonna get a sequel. This released towards the very end of the Super Nintendo's life, as just a few months earlier, this came out. A good amount of changes happened during development, where the focus wasn't just doing the same thing again, they wanted to innovate and create some more puzzle-like levels and even add some diet RPG elements, where in certain parts of the game you're trading items with NPCs. I don't like it. Another big change came to the music as they replaced David Wise with Evelyn Fisher, who did a good job, but it does sound a bit different. She did work on the other two games, so it definitely has that same feel, and I wouldn't go as far as saying it's substantially worse or even sounds bad, but the change is definitely noticeable and is lacking a certain pizzazz. Nintendo has always kept support for their older systems for a short time after the release of the new ones, so getting this game wasn't really shocking. What was though is this horrifying monstrosity. Just like the last entry in the series, Donkey Kong Country 3 had two playable characters, with Diddy Kong getting the axe after all of the allegations, and Dixie Kong filling the starring role alongside her partner Kitty Kong, who looks unique. DK and Diddy both vanish, so the B team gets sent out to get them back from Castle Chaos, where they're being held by the robot boss, also appropriately named Chaos. Of course, the robot is being controlled by Baron K. Rulestein. I'll give you a guess who that really is.
Bowser. Warp. Sandra Bullock.
I really don't know how he kept getting away with it, but apparently K. Rool is back in action, where this time the entire game is set in the Northern Cremisphere, which is not a bad design at all, being full of forests, lakes, snowfields, cabins, and mountains that really do work well. I do think this is a bit of a downgrade from the last entry, as it had so much creative variety that really isn't here, but this still looks phenomenal. Of course, they still use the same rendering techniques as the first game, so it was going to look fantastic. And though I like this more reined-in feeling, I also miss the creative variety that they were going for before. The overworld here is definitely the biggest change, because unlike the prior games where you were on a set path from course to course, this time you could explore the entire overworld using a vehicle. This wasn't anything super substantial, but it was a really fun change that made even selecting levels a bit more fun. It made the world feel even more alive, which is clearly another big theme they were going for with this entry. Playing as Dixie and Kitty felt really good, even though they weren't who anyone had asked for. Dixie still feels phenomenal to control. She can still glide and cover crazy distances, but was definitely a bit more toned down from the last entry. Kitty, on the other hand, was surprisingly fun too. He is bigger and tankier, but still feels a bit better to control than DK, partly because he can skip on water.
It's Jesus!
There are 8 worlds and 48 levels, and this is definitely the most unique feeling entry in the series. There are the standard levels that have traditional platforming, swimming, and minecart segments, but now there are levels with more complex puzzles and obstacles that definitely require a bit more critical thinking. This guy is screwed. While I respect the change, I don't really love the focus on puzzles. They take away from the focus on platforming to give an experience that more so feels like it's just trying to slow you down. I do think they're done pretty well and make great use of the Kong's abilities, but they're just really not for me. As always, there are a good amount of collectibles in all of the worlds, alongside whole quests that you have to work with the Brothers Bear, where you're going around talking to the different brothers, trading items to find extra little goodies. And this was just more annoying than anything else. Again, I do love this helped the world feel even more alive, but this also just felt like bloat where you're going from one place to another trading with these brothers. And if I really want to go and play a game where I'm a courier, I already have one. One of my favorite changes here is how they handle collectibles. It mostly functions the same way as last time, where you see one and you grab it. But now each level has an enemy coin spelled with a K, so you know it's interesting, which are enemies that use a DK coin as a shield, so you need to throw a barrel past them so it bounces off a wall and hits them from behind, which made collecting each of these feel more like its own puzzle. There's already a ton of collectibles just kind of floating there, so to have one where you have to defeat an enemy in a very creative way was really nice. Animal buddies make a return, of course, with some old and some new. They work essentially the same way as last time, where you either ride them or take direct control of them, which helped add a solid variety. I still don't like the shoes. All of the changes here made it feel like a great third entry. It didn't feel like they were trying to copy and paste or that they were scared to try new things. And though I'm not in love with it as much as I am the first two games, I still think it's very solid. The first game was simple and straightforward, and it was a solid platformer with great difficulty. The second was a natural evolution, taking creative risks in the level design and themes while having a focus on Diddy Kong being a major character for the first time. And this added a ton of puzzles and made the world feel more alive than ever. So I can see why a lot of people look at these as one of the best trilogies available on the Super Nintendo. But along with the release of these incredible games, there was another series that took these characters on a very similar adventure, being the Donkey Kong Land trilogy. A title that really doesn't roll off the tongue. Now, the Game Boy was a wild success, and though it required you to put a second mortgage on your house with all of the batteries you'd be using, it was very common at the time to have a home console game have a bit of a downgraded version to play on the go. So while Rare was hard at work making the Donkey Kong Country games, they were also developing these, really helping to push Donkey Kong into as many hands as they possibly could. Now, unlike other series that were strictly making remakes for these consoles, this was meant to be more of a companion title. This still used the same technology that turned 3D models into sprites. So for a Game Boy game, this looked fantastic. Of course, being a handheld console, this still looks a lot worse than it did on the Super Nintendo, but this is still one of, if not the best looking series on the console. Now, the biggest difference here is that the first game was a real separate adventure, while the second two were still different than their home console counterparts, but more so felt like remakes than anything else. The first game's story has Cranky Kong claiming that portable games can't be as good as arcade games, so when he hears Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong brag about Donkey Kong Country, he challenges them to prove they can be in a good Game Boy game.
You gotta love when a game breaks the fourth wall for a story. I like your house.
K. Rool takes this opportunity to steal the banana horde again, so Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong set out across 30 new levels to get them back. Now, this is definitely a solid game, and of the three, if there was one worth playing, I still think it's the first. It feels tight and responsive, but it just has a bit of a rough look compared to the modern day. Not having color made it so sometimes barrels and platforms can kinda go missing, but it's still an extra Donkey Kong game that has a lot of the signature feel the series was known for. Now, the second and third game are a bit of a different story. They are good games, but I don't think there's a reason to really rush out and play them. Donkey Kong Land 2 basically shares the exact same story as Donkey Kong Country 2. K. Rool kidnaps DK and flees to Crocodile Isle, and Dixie and Diddy go to rescue him. It has the same world names, same bosses, and same aesthetics, just on the go. The level designs are different, which is nice, but they really feel like they were made for the Game Boy. Having such a small screen meant there wasn't a lot of time for you to realize an enemy was coming, or if you're shooting across a distance, there could just be an enemy that you didn't know about, something you really didn't have to worry about with the home console game. I don't think anyone would say this is a must-play Donkey Kong Country game, but if you're someone who is really itching for more Donkey Kong Country 2, then this is an option. And the third game is pretty much the exact same way, where the story is mostly the same, with some changes to get the experience to make sense on the Game Boy. They did have to change a couple things like how you move around the map, because on the home console version, they could do a lot more. Again, it is good, but I can't really say there's a reason to play this when you could just play Donkey Kong Country 3. I grew up with all three of these, and they're very interesting, but unless you really want to play them, I think they can be missed. But apparently, the good fellas over at Nintendo and Rare weren't too happy with these either, because they brought the entire trilogy over to the Game Boy Advance. Now, these did change a lot about the Super Nintendo titles, but they were mostly fun. The Game Boy Advance was already strong enough to play most Super Nintendo games, but because the graphics were so deep and intricate, they took a little bit more of a hit than some of the other games that made the jump. They are visually impressive and were great if you wanted to take Donkey Kong Country on the go in a more faithful way, but they still had a few problems. A lot of things got changed across all three titles to make them feel a bit worse. The first game had a lot of new content added, but it also felt really heavy and laggy, so it wasn't fun to play. The second was of course the best of the three, but they oversaturated this to oblivion. The Game Boy Advance's screen wasn't that great, so playing this today is like willingly getting flashbanged. And the third game changed a lot too, to the point where it feels like it's almost a reimagining of the game for the Game Boy Advance. Again, these were really cool, especially for the time, but if you have access to the Super Nintendo versions, you are just better off playing those in pretty much every way. But for years after these released, the entire series just sat in limbo. With Rare being acquired by Microsoft and being neglected for years, Nintendo had to find a new studio to take over the reins if they wanted to make a new Donkey Kong Country experience. But eventually, they found the right people with Retro Studios.
Because my first thought after playing Metroid Prime was get these people making a Donkey Kong Country game stat!
I love the Metroid Prime games, but I'm not sure how someone saw this and thought the next game should be a Donkey Kong Country game. But in all honesty, I'm glad they did. Donkey Kong Country Returns was being developed for the Wii, Nintendo's new hit console that wasn't shaped like a cube. Now, during development, Retro played all of the original games, and they came to the conclusion that keeping these games with a high difficulty was important. So naturally, they wanted to add a focal mechanic of giving this game shaken baby syndrome. The goal was to make a game that was faithful in spirit to the games that came before it, being difficult but not annoying. Of course, one of the major concerns was going to be the visuals, because the original games were known for being stunning. And since almost 15 years have passed, they had a bit more power to work with. Instead of having to render everything and turn it into sprites, everything was now done in real time, which allowed backgrounds to shift and break and be interacted with throughout the entire game. And this became a core part of the entire gameplay experience. Both Iwata and Miyamoto had told the team it was important to keep things that were true to the series, like barrel cannons and minecarts, along with the classic feel of the game. They didn't want this to be a radical change or a complete rework, they wanted it to feel like a return.
Dang, that's good. We should put that on the box.
At this time, 2D platformers were old news. This was 2010, people were more focused on going to space. But with Mario making a return to this format, it only made sense that DK could do it too. For the first time since the original release, you could finally play as DK again, which meant that at this time, there was now officially an equal amount of DK platformers where he could be used. Diddy also came back, but this time was just more so along for the ride. Donkey Kong was now actually fun to use. He was faster and had the ability to chain rolls and jumps together to have a flow state that wasn't possible in the first game. And Diddy Kong was there, but was more so an accessory than anything else. Arguably, the biggest change between the older and newer titles is that this time you could only control DK. So there was no more swapping for different situations, and I like this change, but I also miss the flexibility the older style had. Diddy does have some uses, like being able to use a jetpack and a peanut launcher to assist DK, but that's all he ever does, assist. Another big change here was to the story, with a notable lack of a very specific lizard. A volcanic eruption released the Tiki Tak tribe, who used their powers to hypnotize animals of DK Island to steal DK's bananas.
By the heavens, it happened again!
DK and Diddy then travel across the various island-themed worlds to get his bananas back. Again, they're really not trying to win any awards here for the narrative, more so just get back some bananas. Of course, this is still a side-scrolling adventure with 8 main worlds and a lot of basic themes that we saw in the original game. Whether it was jungles, beaches, caves, or ruins, this was just all of the classic jungle hijinks. As always, this had more to do than just platforming because there were a ton of collectibles and secrets to find in every world. Of course, the bananas and Kong letters make a return alongside the new puzzle pieces that you get for completing various objectives and the new rare orbs that help you unlock the final world of the game, the Golden Temple. But by far, the most aggravating change here came to the controls. The initial release was on the Wii, which allowed 2 different playstyles, either the Wiimote and Nunchuck or just the Wiimote sideways. But both heavily rely on motion controls for rolling around, ground pounds, and blowing, and when I find out whose choice this was, I'm putting a peanut-shaped hole in their chest. Why on earth would someone think that a game like Donkey Kong Country, which is known for its tight controls and difficulty, would need motion controls to be required for the entire game? That's like thinking that driving's too hard, so let's add a couple of drinks to make it easier. It was a really bad idea, and though it worked decently well 80% of the time, that other 20% was like getting kicked directly in the teeth. Luckily, with the other 2 versions available being on the 3DS and the Switch, this was not required. So you can actually sit down and play the game without wanting to burn down your house. Now the other 2 versions being Donkey Kong Country Returns, and of course you can't forget Donkey Kong Country Returns, are definitely the better options. The 3DS version had additional content with a whole extra world which had some of the hardest platforming in the entire series. While the Switch version is in HD, but they chose not to include the 3DS content for reasons I still don't understand.
It was greed.
Would it really have killed them to make this version the premier way to play? It's still an improvement over the original in pretty much every way, but they had 4,167 days to make this better, and they didn't. Yes, I did the math because I am that petty. Now overall, I think this game is still fun, but it definitely felt a bit generic when compared to how innovative the first 3 games were. It was a new studio trying to replicate the formula of another, so I give them a ton of credit for making a game that was still good, but anytime I've played it, I just wanted more. The gameplay was definitely a little flat, but the rest of the presentation was really good. The new enemy designs were good, the new music sounded pretty great with all of the new tracks and remixes, and being on the Wii, there were times where this looked genuinely stunning. They set out with the goal of creating an authentic Donkey Kong Country experience, and they did just that. But they weren't done, because Retro took everything that people loved about this and doubled down on the next game with Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. By this point, Retro had figured out what most people had wanted. With this new game coming out on the Wii U, they easily could have made this a gimmicky mess. But thankfully they didn't and rolled back all of the gimmicks and made a core Donkey Kong Country game that nailed it in almost every way. Where returns kept you on DK Island for the whole game, this time they were ready to branch out again and bring you to different islands to have a better sense of adventure. The locations you explore have better visual designs than last time. To be fair, they are still lacking a bit in the creativity the earlier games had, but they more than make up for it by having some of, if not the best level design that I have ever seen in a 2D platformer. The levels will introduce an idea at the beginning, let you play around with it, only to push it further than you think it could go by the end of the stage. They are challenging but paced perfectly, with a great sense of scale and visual flair that made each more fun than the last. Each island was designed with so much care. The visuals and the gameplay blended together perfectly. The worlds were a great length, where you would finish one and by the time you saw the next, you had to play it to see what was coming next. But one of the best changes here was the return of the legendary David Wise to do the soundtrack. The music here is just as good, if not better, than the earlier entries. Though I think the earlier games were more impressive because of the hardware constraints, this was still wonderful. It was a minor change, but it really helped bring back the identity the earlier games in the series had. Now at this point, if you were expecting a phenomenal story, then you were out of your mind. It was Donkey Kong's birthday, and at his party, a gaggle of Viking ships helmed by the Snowmads approached DK Island and summoned an ice dragon to freeze the entire thing solid, which caused Donkey Kong, Diddy, Dixie, and Cranky to fly off in the distance and have to make their way back. I do appreciate that this is the most unique story of the bunch, but this is about as different as a lemon hiding among limes. I don't think anyone would question it. There were 6 main islands to explore, and they were all done really well. Being released on the Wii U meant this was the first game to be released in full HD, and they nailed it. For a series that was known for having the best graphics on the Super Nintendo, I was impressed they were able to make a game that was still this impressive even when compared to the rest of the series. The enemies, level design, and backgrounds were full of detail that only got better the longer you played. But even better than the visuals was how they reinvented the gameplay to feel fresh but familiar. Like in Returns, you only controlled Donkey Kong, which was a little disappointing, but this time there were other options for who to bring with him on the journey. Of course, Diddy Kong was back with his jetpack to help you hover in the air, giving you safer jumps and an easier time landing. Dixie also made the return with her signature hair twirl that gives you a little bit of upward momentum whenever you jump, which was great for getting that little extra distance or height you would need to get a collectible. But the wild card here was Cranky, who came out of retirement alongside his cane that lets you bounce off spikes and enemies and get a ton of air. These 3 made the game feel so unique. Sure, they weren't fully playable, which could be a bit of a letdown, but having so many options for different scenarios alongside of different segments where they are almost required made each level feel like a little puzzle of who would work best in what scenario. Of course, there were still tons of things to collect, like everything from the last game, but this time there was even more. Whether you're collecting bananas or hitting enemies, you are filling up a Kong Pow meter. And once it's full, you gotta do a special move that wiped out all of the enemies on the screen and turned them into some sort of item. And this could be so helpful. If you're a coward,
I know I am.
This game is already really difficult. I don't mind that they added something to give me a chance to sleep at night. Now, if you wanted to make the game really easy, there was a new item shop that allowed you to spend banana coins in order to get in-level buffs. The different items had different effects, like giving you invincibility, saving you from falling in a pit, and giving you extra hearts, to even more. And I think this was a great way to encourage you to go around and collect everything in the game. Now, when this game got brought to the Switch, there was an actual easy mode known as Funky Mode, which allowed you to play as Funky Kong.
Are you sure this isn't hard mode? No, what do you— oh, gross, put on pants!
Now, Funky Kong was more than just the CEO of seduction. He was also built like an all-around unit. He had 5 hearts instead of 2, the ability to double jump, hover in the air, and roll infinitely, and even a complete immunity to spikes. With the only real downside being that he can't use buddies like DK can, but also why would he need to? I used to hear a lot of people complaining that this makes the game too easy, but nobody is making you play this way. It more so serves as a way for people who don't want the game to be too challenging to experience it too, and I think that was a great idea. The major reservation that some people have when going back to play the originals is that they can be brutally hard, especially towards the end. Now, if you're playing them on Switch Online, you could just hit the oops I did it again button. So if we're comparing the easy mode here, I think I prefer this. But Tropical Freeze was by far one of the best games that released on the Wii U. This came back during Nintendo's hyperfixation on turning every series they had into a 2D platformer, but honestly, I think this was the best game they made. Now, with all of these games, I don't think there is one that I would even consider bad. But if I had to pick the worst, I would definitely say it's Returns on the Wii. Motion controls and platformers mix as well as ambient and Twitter, so I think it's fair to say that this is an easy last place. My personal favorite of the games is Donkey Kong Country, mostly because this was the first game that I beat that was a genuine struggle to get through. But I think the best games are a tie between either Donkey Kong Country 2 or Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Both of these are exceptional in almost every single way, and you really can't go wrong with either. Tropical Freeze is the more accessible option that I think would be, quote, better for all ages, while Donkey Kong Country 2 is arguably the best game that released for one of the best consoles of all time. So needless to say, yes, these are not just good, they are some of the best games in their genre. And if you have not played them yet, you are legally required to.